Hi, welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii. This is our Asian program, ThinkTech Asia. Used to be called Asia in Review. And we're broadcasting from Pioneer Plaza, downtown Honolulu. I'm your host, Hong Jiang. I'm from a geography department at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And our topic today is farmer suicide and rural distress in India. Our special guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Cedar Louis, who is a visiting scholar at East-West Center. And she graduated from UH Manoa in geography department. And she has been doing a lot of work on the rural Indian issues in rural India, in agricultural movement, rural livelihoods, farmer suicide. And I'll call you Cedar, is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Welcome. Thank you. For being here. So first, just think about the whole topic we're going to talk about, the farmer suicide, farmer suicides. That's a very distressful situation. Can you tell us about, what happened in India, and is there a sudden increase of farmer suicide in recent years?
Yeah. So farmer suicides, the spate of farmer suicides started in around 1998 after India introduced neoliberal economic policies. And neoliberal economic policies are policies that introduce privatization and opened up the country to freer world markets. And at the same time, the state that had played a large role in agriculture in providing research and extension and subsidies and rural credit and some quite deep safety nets pulled back from that. And so small farmers were suddenly given these options to practice more commercialized agriculture with the promise of more profits, but it also made it very risky for them because they didn't have the safety nets, they didn't have the state as present to support them, and so they were kind of exposed to these very risky conditions of prices fluctuating on the world markets, of any way dealing with climate change and weather fluctuations, and on top of that, new crops that farmers had not, hadn't gone through the process of learning how to deal with failures and pest attacks, the slow process of innovation and diffusion that happens. And the chance of profits when the crops did really well, especially genetically modified cotton was a big major crop that has also been blamed for the suicides.
So there are a lot of very rich issues to deal with, so many different aspects of things that's really linked to something that's also happening elsewhere in terms of what you just talked about, in terms of dealing with the market, the uncertainty of the market, the new crops, even the GMOs. I know even people in Hawaii are dealing with that. But back to India, maybe we can kind of just look at the different aspects of what really led to the farmer suicide. And before we do that, can you give us any kind of first of all, it's probably a morbid question. How do farmers commit suicide? And do you have a kind of any number to indicate there's this jump?
The most common way that farmers have been committing suicide are hanging or drinking pesticides.
Oh my.
And mostly it has been men, but it's only because we're not really sure of the numbers, what is a farmer suicide and what is a suicide that's happened in the rural areas but it's not related to crop failure.
Okay.
It's kind of, it's a little hard to tell. But the spate, there have been, I'm not exactly sure, but at least 250,000 farmer suicides in the last 15 years.
Wow. I mean, this is things that we do see reported, that there are these, increasing suicide. So look like the reasons are multifaceted.
Yes.
And maybe you can take us to the different reasons and putting it together. We call it rural stress. First, talk about the neoliberal policy. You talk about it. It's a removal of the state.
Yes.
And tell us more about it.
So I'll start with an example. So the suicides first started in the region where I did my fieldwork, which is the Telangana region of India. It's a south central semi-arid region that is primarily rain-fed. It has an abundance of more infertile soils, red soils, and also lesser amount of black fertile soils. And it has a history of feudal systems and has a larger concentration of lower castes and classes of farmers, higher poverty rates, lower human development rates. So
it's a place that was dealing with poverty to start with.
Yes,
right?
yes. And there's a lot of high levels of land concentration, which means greater amounts of land were owned by just a small number of rich families. And then there's this history of bonded labor in the region, and this is common to large parts of India, but in this particular area these institutions have been more entrenched, the feudal institutions. And so the suicide started in an area where farmers were encouraged to grow cotton, commercially. Cotton has been grown in the area for a long time, but small farmers generally just grow a little bit of cotton. But now they were encouraged to grow cotton, like monocrop cotton. And this was before the introduction of genetically modified cotton. And they were responding also to high prices on the world market. And so Indian farmers are known to be quite opportunistic, in terms of if they can make a profit. So there was a shift en masse to growing cotton without taking into consideration whether you need irrigation, what the climate, and at the same time, so when cotton prices crashed and brought losses to farmers, that is when the spate of suicides started in that region.
So this growing of cotton in this area, in terms of agriculture, look at history just a little bit. Did this area benefit from the Green Revolution of the earliest stage at all, or did it not?
So the suicides in general in the country are concentrated in the states that were more advanced in agriculture. These were Green Revolution states.
So Green Revolution states, and suddenly now there are a lot more farmers committing suicide. What's the connection there?
There's many different things going on, and then there are also regional differences. But the region where I did my field work was actually didn't really benefit from the Green Revolution. But generally, that's the contradiction in an area that has experienced so much commercialization. What has suddenly happened. So what has happened, in my opinion, is neoliberal policies, the pulling back of the state, combined with environmental factors. The other issue is small farmers who in the past did not take such big risks with commercial crops such as this are being compelled to grow these crops because they have few options to diversify their livelihoods. The neoliberal policies were supposed to expand opportunities for the rural poor. Where do the rural poor go generally if they're unskilled? They get absorbed into manufacturing jobs, either go into the urban areas or there's rural industry. And since those sectors were stagnating, so farmers relied more heavily on their land. And if you have a small piece of land and you have to survive on it, then you're going to try and maximize the profit you can get from it.
So is it fair to say that neoliberal policy is the state started to remove from, let's say, the agricultural sector and started to push the sector to the market.
Yes.
And believing that the market would take care of everything.
Yes.
But the small part farmers are not able to deal with the stress in the market.
Yes.
So were they planting food crops before, and now they're planting cotton like a commercial crop?
So they were planting either food crops or less risky commercial crops. And then there are some crops that are considered both food and commercial, like groundnut, which is peanut, and sugarcane. Sugarcane is not really considered a food crop, but these are older commercial crops. But another important aspect of neoliberal policies is farmers rely heavily on state extension, research, and credit, rural credit, and subsidies for pesticides and fertilizers, not pesticides, mainly fertilizers and seeds, and power to pump water for irrigation. As these have been curtailed, and with the entry of private actors into the seed sector, the cost of seeds have gone up. The costs of cultivation have increased, and needs for cash have increased, but cash is less available. And other changes that have been happening with the impact of globalization is, and privatization is education is more expensive, healthcare costs have gone up, cost of getting daughters and children married has gone up. So the needs for cash are high, and so farmers can only make that money off of their land if they cannot diversify out of agriculture. So that is why they take bigger and bigger risks.
In terms of taking risks, we kind of see farmers as a less risk-taking in their attitude unless they see people benefiting from it. There are cases when people do benefit from these new crops, but the risk is so high that on average they're actually worse off.
Yes, yes. That is the case in the area where I did field work. One village, within the space of 2 years, their land went from 10% of the cultivable area under cotton to 50% in 2 years. That is a massive shift, and that is just one village that I looked at. I got the crop records. And so this is happening in many places. It has serious implications for food security, for just availability of food locally, and also it has serious, it tells you how rapid these shifts are. And there was one more thing I wanted to highlight in this is, yes, the farmers I talked to, and I asked them, they are very aware of the risk. It's not like they're going into this blind. I asked them, I said, you've heard of the suicides, cotton is risky, it's expensive to buy the seeds, why are you growing it? And they said, our neighbors grew cotton last year and the year before, and we kept growing sorghum and other food crops because we didn't want to take those risks. But they made so much money, and they can earn you can earn 20,000 rupees from your land from cotton from 1 acre, whereas if I grow sorghum, I can maybe earn 2,000 rupees from 1 acre.
That's a huge jump, 10 times more.
So they said, we thought, why don't we also do it? And so watching others do well, they made the shift. Unfortunately, the year they decided to make the shift, the rains failed.
So it's area, you said the soil wasn't good, and then if the rain failed, then cotton needed a lot of irrigation.
You needed rain, you needed black soils, deeper soils, but as it's spreading, it's like Russian roulette. Everyone wants to plant cotton. And people who are landless are leasing land at exorbitant rates to plant cotton. So, it's that whole kind of feeling that this is a very risky enterprise.
Yeah. Well, let's take a short break, and then we can explore other kind of distress and the implications of the crop failure in the rural area. Again, this is a ThinkTech Asia program, and we've been talking about farmer suicides and rural distress in India. We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, I'm Martin Despang, and I'm the host together with the one and only Ali Amashta, and our show is called Urban Transcendence. And urban transcendence is about identifying where we have a unique situation of a vibrant city in one of the most beautiful natural environments. So how these two can coincide, sometimes conflict, how they could find reciprocity in the 21st century is what we're excited about. And we're planning on bringing in a diverse body of guests, both from the arts and the science and the established and the wise and the emerging generation. So hope you will join us. We'll always be on Thursdays from 1 to 2 p.m. Thank you.
Hi, we're back. We're live. This is ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Hong Jiang. And we'll be speaking with Dr. Elizabeth Cedar Louis, a visiting scholar from East West Center, about farmer suicide and rural distress in India. So right before the break, we talk about these new crops, the commercial crops that rural people, farmers are planting, and then when you have an environmental failure. But I suppose there's also unpredictability in the market, the world market, if they are relying on that to sell their crop, right?
Yes.
What about other kind of, other actors coming in to help them?
So as with the neoliberal economic policies, the seed sector, for example, which is a $2 billion market, maybe even higher now, was opened up to private actors. Prior to this, it was the government that was providing all the research and providing seeds to farmers at a subsidized cost. So Monsanto and other large players have entered the market with local affiliates and have marketed and sold their genetically modified cotton seeds. And often the costs of seeds are really high. Farmers do not regenerate their own, do not reuse their own seeds. They go back every year and have to buy new seeds, which is another it's a big issue. And with the withdrawal of the state in research and extension, when cotton, if there are pest attacks, if crops fail, if things are not going as, if farmers don't know what's happening, it's a new crop, they're trying it for the first few times. They go back to the person who sells the seeds and the pesticides and fertilizers, asking them what they should do because they have no idea. And often what happens is they use cocktails of pesticides, and when they should be spraying the fields just a few times, they spray it like 20 times, 30 times, and pesticides are very expensive. And they get into debt, often with the dealers of the seeds and pesticides, and then they have to sell their crop back to them. So they get into debt in this way. And with the state absent and the state not even regulating the market, often spurious seeds have been distributed that don't do as well. But by and large, although there is a lot of resistance to genetically modified cotton, by and large, farmers are interested in growing genetically modified cotton because, according to them, there is less chance of failure. And
do you also produce more per acre?
Yes, I'm not really sure that the jury is out on producing more per acre, but cotton production has increased in India as more and more farmers grow cotton, and it has been doing really well in areas like Gujarat, which is the northwest part of India that is irrigated. So it's much less risky if it's irrigated, but in the areas where people have been growing cotton and committing suicide is where it's not irrigated, and so the risks are much higher.
I see. So I suppose there's no bankrupt law in India. People, well, I can't pay back, and what do I do?
No.
No. Are there people forced to sell their land to
Yes.
deal with this?
Yes, what happens, what leads to the suicides is a cycle of dispossession. So farmers are in debt already. They have to send they want to send their child to engineering college, and it's like 100,000 rupees of capitation fee, or someone needs a hysterectomy, and there's huge debt already, or they sink a bore well, which is an exorbitant amount, and they don't find water, they sink another bore well. So they take these risks because they're banking on a successful cotton crop, or whatever the commercial crop they're growing, that they will get a good harvest. And then when that fails, then they can't face the money lenders. They are imminent danger of losing their land, shame at this failure, daughters to be married off, and then what happens is the suicide.
Wow, we can imagine all these things adding up. It's a very stressful situation. Your livelihood, your life is at stake.
Yes.
I wonder about the local community kind of safety net. Any mutual help that's at place? These seed companies coming in, they don't seem to deal with the local social dynamics over here. They don't seem to help a lot of the local people. Any other help that they could get?
The state provides crop insurance, and the state does give compensation for families where unfortunately there are suicides. So you get compensation after the suicide has happened. But before it happens, there is not much in terms of support. There is crop insurance, and the state has, in some parts of the country, some states of the country have actually moved in and tried to regulate how the cost of seeds, and if crops have been failing large scale, have gone after the seed companies to make them accountable. But in terms of safety nets, in general, extended families are the safety net and your subcaste, but there's only that much you can do for someone if everyone doesn't have enough resources.
And here we're talking about issues in rural India, which is a large population in India. What is the percentage of rural population?
I think more or less about 70% of people still live in the rural areas.
So these kind of rural issues are huge. I suppose it would be something that the whole society is alerted to. Has there been a lot of awareness and effort to address these kind of issues in recent years?
I think the middle classes and upper middle class, the urban middle class in India are not generally very tuned into what is happening in the rural areas, and are not too concerned about the suicides because it doesn't impact them directly. But the suicides though have started making news, have been for a while, thanks to some excellent reporting and in-depth research on these issues that have been coming out in the urban papers. And there have been a couple of really good films, Bollywood films, one especially that highlighted this problem. It was a popular film, popular media, but it did really kind of portray what the situation is in areas where there's rural distress. And so there is definitely more awareness about it. Now the state has been making some inroads into addressing rural distress by writing off rural debt, but unfortunately more like 2/3 of debt is to informal sources, not to banks. And so you have to deal with money lenders. There's no way to get rid of that kind of debt for farmers. They've been providing insurance, they've been providing support prices for crops so that there's a guaranteed price for certain crops, and certain states have done better than other states in dealing with rural distress. But it's not enough right now because the issues are much larger. I mean, the market as it is right now is still dominating, the economic sector.
And I suppose there are probably unrest going on. There are a lot of discontent in the rural area.
Yes, there has discontent has happened because of many reasons, and a lot of the unrest and the conflict, it's kind of peripheral to this topic, but there has been, in areas that indigenous, the tribal Adivasi people live, they've dealt with dispossession of their land, mining and dams, and building of factories and highways, and the absence of the state, their desires to participate in development, and they don't have those options. So there's a large, widespread movement, Maoist inspired movement in parts of India. But as far as conflict, any kind of revolution, nothing, I don't see that happening. There are safety nets in place, and by and large, I think people are doing better in terms of food security. Things are better, things have improved. As long as the state has played a major role, the state, there are definitely positives and negatives, but for the poor, the state has been a really important support.
It's very interesting because, here in the US, there are people who are calling for the state to, hands off. But here in the situation in India, you're arguing that the state can't just leave everybody in the rural area to the market,
No.
that you needed to provide the safety net. You need to
Yes.
provide the infrastructure. You need to provide the subsidy, and
Yes.
you need to protect the rural population.
Yes.
And so do you see India just had an election. Do you see the new administration moving any way in this direction at all?
It's too new to tell, but the new administration, I believe, are big supporters of the neoliberal economic policies. And India being an electoral democracy, you are answerable to your constituents or you won't win the next election, to put it simply. So you cannot completely do away with safety nets.
Okay.
Because your huge voting block in the rural areas,
Here
people
we're
have
talking about
lost,
majority of the
right.
people living in the
People
rural
have-
area.
Yeah. So political parties have lost the elections based on a few, the removal of safety nets. So, you cannot, even though you support all-out privatization or free markets, your hands are tied as to how much you can push that through with, the electoral democracy. So the safety
That's
nets
kind of a safety net in a
itself,
structural way.
right?
Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
What about the effort to move the rural population off the land and move into, say, urban sector, industrial sector? You have a huge population. That's one thing. You also have unequal possession of land. That's another thing.
Yes. That was the whole idea behind neoliberal reforms was, as you opened up agriculture to the private sector, then areas where agriculture is not viable would pass into private hands, consolidate, and people would move to the cities, find jobs in industry, and, not depend on their land. And then agriculture would become more profitable because it would have private sector investment. But that is not really the case. That is not what is happening. The industry has been stagnating mostly, and it was the services and the financial sectors that have done really well with neoliberal policies, and these sectors do not absorb rural labor.
Because they don't have the skill.
Yeah, they don't have the skills. Most, the area where I did field work, most houses, most members of the households that I worked with were illiterate. And it was just the first generation of their children had started going to school. So it was seeing a very drastic change in, the labor relations and the availability of labor for agriculture. And most of these people would not be able to take advantage of any kind of job that required an education or skill.
So look like the development in India has left a large rural population behind.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would say.
Wow. That's a huge issue there. So we're going to take another short break. Again, this is ThinkTech Asia. We've been talking about farmer suicide and rural distress in India. We'll be right back.
My name is Alice Lee Hagan. I host the ThinkTech Hawaii BizEd Spotlight. We talk about fascinating people and interesting issues that affect our island state here in Hawaii. We broadcast every Thursday from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 4 and on Olelo 54. Make sure you tune in and we'll see you soon. Aloha.
Hello, we're back. We're live. This is ThinkTech Asia. We've been talking with Dr. Elizabeth Cedar Louis about India rural issues, farmer suicides and rural distress in India. Maybe anything you want to add to the early discussion, because we could just bring the photos.
Yeah, let's bring the photos.
Yeah, so we can bring the photos.
Okay.
So what is this?
So this is a picture of one of the fields in Telangana region that is growing banana and sugarcane, and these are irrigated commercial crops.
Next one.
And this is more of a landscape view, the sunflower being grown, which is also a high value commercial crop in the Telangana. And this is an interesting photo. This is a field of genetically modified cotton being sprayed by a farmer who you can see has no protective gear. So there are a whole lot of other issues that I have not really discussed, which are the impacts of pesticides and fertilizers on the soil and on human health, but it's beyond the scope of this discussion right now. And now this is a field, this is one of my, the local farmers that I spend a lot of time with, and this is a she's practicing a diversified agriculture of subsistence crops with sorghum and lentils and other crops. And this is a farmer who saves his own seeds, and you can see the little terracotta pots with seeds which they will seal and store for the next year. And this is a field where a woman farmer is weeding a potato crop. It's very labor intensive, as you can see.
So interesting. So all these issues that you talk about, you know, many different aspects of it, the state isn't doing a whole lot to help the rural people. So what are the other efforts? What's the way out of this? Is there a way? I'm sure you want to say there is a way.
There is no easy answer.
Okay.
I mean, it's the sheer mass of population. The state has been doing a fair job, considering that India is such a diverse country. There's so many different constituents going after, you know, having different agendas. And it is a democracy that has been working and kind of hobbling along, you know. So the state can only do that much sometimes but I think that moving forward, I mean, at least the debates out there is, you know, we need to increase safety nets, which India has passed a food security bill which guarantees a certain amount of food to 75% of the population.
Oh, 75. But these people you're talking about that's 25%. That's probably left behind.
No, these people will come under the if they get counted, yes, they are in the 75%. So that is a step, a very positive step.
Okay.
In how it's being implemented at each state level is a question that we will have to see. Some states have a good history of providing safety nets, and other states are not run very efficient, you know, very well. There's high levels of corruption. So the debates are, you know, what can the state do? You know, the state has to come back in a much bigger way to support agriculture and farmers. I think across the board, you know, those who support market policies, those who are more left-leaning and support larger state, across the board there's agreement that there needs to be more investment in agriculture, more investment in infrastructure, more investment in all these areas that the state has pulled out of. But who is going to do the investment is the big question.
Where the money is coming
Yes,
from.
is it going to be the private sector? Is it going to be public-private partnership, or is it going to be the state? The private sector tends not to go into areas where where, like especially infrastructure, areas that are not profitable, areas where actually the poor will benefit. So the state has to move into those areas. There are social movements. There's food sovereignty movements. There's a lot of civil society organizing that has been, that also has their own agenda, but speaks. There are grassroots movements that center the problems of poor farmers. Solutions for these.
In terms of, let me ask you about this food sovereignty movement. Is it about food self-sufficiency or having enough kind of help to get the food? What does that mean?
So food sovereignty is a global, it's a transnational movement, but is very locally specific in terms of what kinds of interventions you can do. But basically, it promotes small farms, sustainable agriculture, and localization.
So you need to get off the BT cotton. You need to start to plant these, food for subsistence.
Yes, subsistence-focused food crops, ecological agriculture, to break your dependence and to break the power of corporations in agriculture.
Okay.
So that is the ideal of food sovereignty. And does food sovereignty actually work on the ground? I mean, is this what farmers want? That's a whole different question.
That's another interesting issue, because if you say, well, to the farmers, come back and grow your subsistence grains, first of all, would farmer want that? Because if you do that, you don't have the cash to engage in other kind of economy.
Yes.
And if you do that, then you probably can't get out of the rural area. So what is the future of that kind of a strategy?
There's definitely a tension there. I mean, without doubt, it is my opinion that agriculture has to move in a more sustainable direction in terms of how we treat the soil, in how we use water, and preserving water, harvesting water, making irrigation available on a small scale to farmers, not using as many pesticides and fertilizers. It needs to move in that direction for sure. But the solution to what is happening in the rural areas does not lie in the rural areas necessarily. It has to be a broader vision. First, farmers need to have food and livelihood security before they can, even think about, okay, do I want to grow food crops or, in an ecological way? If they don't have enough money to educate their children, they're not going to grow millets, and they can eat those millets, but then they cannot do much else.
That's right. There are other things that's interesting looking at what you do. You are also working on health and sanitation issues in rural India. I suppose that's also part of this whole complete livelihood kind of picture.
Yes. Yes. So the last position I held was as a postdoctoral researcher, and I worked on a project funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to look at areas of India that sanitation was successful. And sanitation, access to water and toilets is it's a huge issue in the country. Exposure to fecal matter has been one of the largest killers of children through diarrhea, and has been recently, there's been studies that show that childhood stunting there's a direct relation between stunting of children and exposure and poor sanitation. And childhood stunting has a lot of future implications, because children don't develop, and they don't do well in school. So there's a lot of implications for, even economic.
So these kind of issues may not drive farmer suicide, but that they are impacting a whole, rural population and their children in the future.
Yes.
So we're talking about many different issues. We're talking about not just agricultural, not just the financial failure, the environmental issues there, but also education, health, and other kind of quality of life situation. It just seems like there's so much that needed to be done in the rural area.
Yes.
Okay, so talking about solution, it's probably going to be coming kind of piecemeal.
Yeah, I mean, it is so complex and also very locally specific. There are some parts of India that are doing much better than other parts.
Yeah.
And there are some parts of India that are doing much better, but at the cost of the environment. That's something that we don't talk about so much. I mean, we've seen in China, the development, the pace of development has taken its toll on land, and right now large areas of land, 1/5 of the land is so polluted that you cannot actually, it's not arable anymore. So these are issues that we should be thinking about in India too. Development, yes, and we need maybe to use pesticides and fertilizers, but maybe there are other ways that we can also think of developing. And education is key. Dealing with gender issues, women's health, women's education, children's health, the provision of basic safety nets. These things have to all be in place, and the provision of diversified livelihood options for the rural areas.
In areas that are doing better, can they provide a good kind of example, a good way forward for other areas to see where things can go and how can the rural population can be lifted out of poverty? And so that's one question. The second question is immediately in dealing with the life and death kind of situation, how can farmer suicides be prevented?
So areas that have done well in general in the rural areas, historically farmers have had secure access to land, and Kerala is a good example of a state that was run by a communist government that was elected, so more like a socialist government, where they did large-scale land reform, and at the same time there was a big emphasis on education and health. And so today, they had a large skilled workforce, people emigrated, worked in the Middle East, send remittances home. And so Kerala is one example of a state that has done well.
So multiple kind of sources of income they can draw on.
Right. But it's also a state where that has very high, very strong labor unions, and many times it's hard to introduce privatization. So there's a debate on how to go forward. But politics is a really important aspect of development, and the states that have better political parties and institutions do better.
So just 1 minute to answer this, to address this immediate question of farmer suicide. Is it reducing? Is it still going up? And any quick ways to help to keep these lives?
I think the only way to prevent suicides is a very concerted effort by the state to support families on the edge in terms of providing enough safety nets and credit and subsidies and supports in agriculture.
So I hope more people would hear this argument and the state would come in to help save lives. And thank you so much, Cedar, for helping educating us about this very stressful situation, but very important nation, very important sector, the rural sector in India. And thank you.
Thank you.
Again, this is ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Hong Jiang, and I want to thank you very much for tuning in. I'll see you next time.